I think the talks are going to go ahead. It's just a matter of time until when we see them materializing. So a couple of considerations which lead me to that conclusion. First of all, that the U.S.'s naval blockade is meant as a pressure tactic for Iran to come forward for a deal. Whether a deal is acceptable or not would likely be a challenge between compromises on what each side sees as doable concessions. But I think the signaling from the U.S. front, and we see the lead-up in the preparations as well, is something that the U.S. is willing to dial up the pressure, but they want to negotiate from a position of strength. And from the U.S. perspective, naval blockade will kind of suggest or add up for that being as a position of strength. But I think a key weakness over there is that unless Iran and the U.S. make tangible efforts to coordinate their expectations about what could qualify as a doable, workable, executable deal, I think any of these pressure tactics can risk upending the kind of trust surplus which both sides need in order to proceed forward, including through Pakistan's mediation.
Iran is saying that it's quite far from any final agreement. Donald Trump much more upbeat. So is it clear, actually, how far apart the two sides are at this point?
Yes, I think it's pretty clear. So, for example, on the uranium enrichment front, Iranians likely want to maintain it as something which would not have outside concessions. I think what we've seen over the past couple of weeks is the fact that the Iranians are willing to, for example, agree on a lesser threshold in terms of how much of a blockade we want on it. But I think what makes it a key sticking point is, for example, when the Iranians talk about oversight, it includes certain powers the U.S. has not exactly been too friendly or too cooperative towards, and also these threats about maintaining military pressure on Iran, as you talk about the Strait of Hormuz as well, as something which leads to a lot of irritants going forward. So I think in order for consensus to be built around these areas, there needs to be a tangible guarantee from the Iranian perspective about the U.S. Force posture in the region, that there are not going to be a lot of disruptions in terms of those negotiations. So I think from where things stand right now, Strait of Hormuz and the uranium enrichment red lines are something which is so deeply entrenched that leads both sides to be far apart as opposed to be very closer.
So that nuclear issue, it's such a difficult one to navigate. What would Tehran want in return for giving up their nuclear ambitions or delaying them?
Yeah, so I think giving up nuclear ambitions is the kind of a language which the Iranians have heard in the past, and they've seen it transpire to distrust as well. I think what the Iranians would basically want is a middle ground on the nuclear question. So, for example, giving up its right to nuclear enrichment is something which would be an incremental process. What needs to happen right now is a middle ground in terms of the years of concessions that the U.S. is willing to make for it. For example, if the U.S. is willing to, for example, lift up about over 2/3 of sanctions on Iran as a confidence-building measure for Iran to, for example, agree to U.S. demands about enrichment being capped or downsized considerably over the next coming years. I think that's something which the Iranians can work with, because for the Iranians, they have to justify any deal with the U.S. domestically with the constituencies. That remains a far cry if the position remain maximalist. So I think that's where the contention stands.
How important are the role of good mediators in a situation like this, where there's very little trust between both parties, and we're not even sure if J.D. Vance, who is a very high-profile member of the U.S. cabinet, he might not even be there. It's not 100% clear. So talk to us about the role of mediators in a situation like this.
It's critical. So, for example, when you talk about a mediator, he has to have favorable proximity to both adverse parties when their position is so polarized. You need to have a country, for example, Pakistan fits the bill on many occasions. For example, when we talk about coordinating expectation with Iran, to have a strategic channel open with Washington allows you to kind of see where the constraints lie from each side's perspective. And I think on the other front, mediation becomes critical, because when you talk about kind of tempering some of the external shocks which rise out of this conflict, is something which the U.S. and the Iranians themselves cannot necessarily negotiate or bring to the table. I think that's where mediating parties such as Pakistan, we've seen Egypt and Turkey hit from the sidelines, can kind of create this atmosphere of shuttle diplomacy where both sides can communicate proposals, push back and forth without exactly being seen as weak in terms of the public diplomacy, because obviously the temperature within the U.S. and Iran is to maintain a strong arm posture. So I think from that point of view, mediation becomes critical, because what happens behind closed doors is this incremental consensus building process which keeps diplomacy on the table. And I think from that point forward, Pakistan's role has been demonstrated as effective over the past couple of weeks. Building on that will require regional consensus, something which allows Pakistan to also filter in the feedback from Gulf powers who've been disproportionately affected into this process. So it remains very multi-vector. I think mediation kind of fits the bill on that front.
Well, thank you so much for speaking to us. That's Hannan Hussain from the global think tank Initiate Futures in Islamabad.
Pleasure.